Welcome back to another pen turning video. Originally we started off with the standard 7mm kit. Looked like that. And then we modified it by shortening the joint between the top and the bottom and adding some mechanism behind the clip. That was the second shot at it. I've done another version off camera which is very similar to that one, except I have a top now that hides the clip in a little different way. Well, I want to do something else. I'm now going to make a pen that looks like this. Has no clip, has no center line, and it's done with one solid piece. Actually, the process is really pretty doggone simple. We assemble the parts, and I'll show you how to do that. And we do it in one solid blank. The only key to this is drilling a hole to exactly the right depth to accommodate both brass tubes and not going through the other end. Let me show you how we did it. Let's start with the standard 7mm pen kit. Don't need all the parts, but I do need the two brass tubes. I don't need the clip. Need the transmission. Need the pen tip. And later on I'll add the refill. First thing I need to do is to figure out how deep of a hole I need to drill, and that requires knowing the length of the two brass tubes. So I'm going to take my blank, this is a piece of ebony, and I'm going to measure the two tubes, add a little extra length, and that's how deep the hole needs to be, plus a little bit for the top. So I pen marked that. I'm going to go to the bandsaw, cut that piece off. And now I'm going to have to drill the holes to the full depth. I do most of my work on the lathe, as I have said in other videos. I've cut the pen blank as square as I possibly can, and so that I'm squaring it up in the four-jaw chuck as best possible. I want that hole to go straight. So I have a shorter version of my 7mm drill bit. I can bring it up and start drilling very slowly so that it centers properly when it gets going. Now this is ebony. And ebony is an oily, exotic wood. And so you're going to notice here in a second as I pull the drill bit out after only a short amount that it's already loaded with chips. It's that oiliness of the wood filling the flutes of the drill bit. So I have to stop and clear the bit very frequently. As soon as I have a hole deep enough that I can trust it, I can do what's called plunge cutting, by pushing the drill bit in, pulling it out, clearing the chips. You can see how they fly out of the bit pretty easily. Well, I'm about at the limit of what I can do with that standard 7mm drill bit. So I'm going to install a longer one that has a much wider flute. Will clear easier. But because it's long, it would have a tendency to flex. So I have a pilot hole, which is really, really good to keep this thing in alignment. So continue my plunge cutting down to the mark I have put on the side of the drill bit, so I know exactly how far I need to go for the two brass tubes that I've marked out. In spite of that, it's still a good idea to check your depth every now and then. So I've set a set of calipers to the right depth and insert it in the hole, and I find it just bottoms perfectly. So I'm confident that the hole is the right depth, not too deep, not too shallow. So now I'm going to take the blank over to the bench and go to the next step, which is to install one of the brass tubes and it's going to be installed in the bottom of the hole. Now I've roughed up that brass tube ahead of time, so it's going to have a little tooth when it sets into the glue. And I'm using some medium thick CA glue in the bottom of the hole, and it runs down the side a little bit too, I know that. And I'm going to push that brass tube all the way to the bottom of the hole. This is where it needs to be seated. Little glue on the side of the hole higher than that can easily be removed by just passing the drill bit through there. So while the glue is setting, I'm going to assemble the pen kit itself, the working mechanisms anyway. Back to the lathe with my centers. I'm going to install the nib into the lower brass tube, the one that is not glued in. And because there's no wood around supporting that thing, this is a pretty flexible piece, and it'd be easy to damage it or get it started not square. And if you watch this one go in, you'll see that I'm starting that one off with a problem. It is not square. So I'm going to have to back it out, square the tube up to the nib, and continue to insert it all the way. Got to be very cautious. So it's in. The nib is now seated in the one end of the brass tube. And now what we need to do is to install the transmission in the opposite end of the brass tube. And again, careful alignment is important here. And we insert it to the mark. Use the refill to test whether the insertion is deep enough, and it looks like it's right on the spot. So the mechanism is fully assembled and ready to go. Well, meanwhile the glue is dried. I'm going to go over to my disc sander and simply square off the end of that blank. I need it to be square so that when the nib is pressed in, it seats properly. Now it just takes a few seconds. So the blank is ready, and I'm going to assemble it on a mandrel with a few extra 7mm bushings. The point is I want the blank to be pressed between the bushings and the tailstock, and not necessarily using the length of the mandrel for end-to-end support. So a couple of 3 extra 7mm bushings. Push the blank on and head to the lathe. I'm using the standard 60-degree cone center initially, and this gives me clearance to turn the end of the pen blank to a round shape. It's going to leave a little hole in the center, I know that, but I can easily take care of that later on. So just going to rough it out, crank the speed up as fast as I can get this lathe to go. And I'm using my standard roughing out tool, which in this case is a 3/8 bowl gouge. I tend to use that a lot for the initial cuts. This is all the fun there is in turning a pen, is the cutting of the wood. So I take a little bit of extra time just to enjoy the process a little bit more that way. So I'm going to get it round with the bowl gouge, but I'll also pull out some of the wood and bring it into shape a little bit. This is going to just have a gentle curve from the nib end, which is the bushing end, to the top end, which will then be rounded over. Well, I got close enough with that. Time to put it away and go to my favorite pen turning tool, which is, of course, my skew chisel. Skew chisel's nice because it leaves a smoother surface and less rough sanding that has to be done, but it also allows me to create a gentle shape without a lot of undulations that need to be removed later on. So I'm getting the one end down to the bushing dimension. And on the other end, you'll see I'm turning towards the top, but I'm leaving a little bit of wood that I'm going to be sacrificing in a few minutes. It has a hole in the end of it from that 60-degree cone. So I'm going to just allow that to stay there. I'm going to do most of my sanding and finishing of the whole blank before I go to putting that curve on the top. So dust collection in place. And my general sanding process is to go from each grit. I start with 180 grit. I can do a little shaping there. I can pull it down to the bushings if I needed to remove a little bit more wood. And after I've sanded with the lathe on, wipe the sawdust free, I will sand in the direction of the grain. This goes for every grit. This removes circular marks that's been put on by the sandpaper. So 180. Next I go to is 220. That washer there, if it's in the way, I'll remove it in a few minutes. It's there to allow me to screw chucks onto the headstock and be able to remove them easily. Most of the time it's an accessory that's helpful. Right now it's in the way. So there's 220, 320, 400 depending on what the grit of the wood is itself. But I always finish up with 4/0 steel wool. And so this doesn't cut like sandpaper cuts. Sandpaper scratches. Steel wool cuts more like a plane, so it brings up a lot of smoothness on the surface. So I've got that pretty well shaped down. Again, even with the 4/0 steel wool, I will rub in the direction of the grain. Now it's time to come back and remove that little end piece and round it over using my skew chisel to create a half bead on that end. I'll roll it over. I've switched to the long point so I can see where I'm cutting much better. Okay, there it's free. And there's a little nib right on the end which needs to be cut off. A couple of short passes and that's done. So now I have a sanding job just like I did on the whole pen. I'm going to go through all the grits and I can handle any shaping issues with my 180, then the 220, and ultimately back to my 4/0 steel wool again. So the blank is pretty well shaped, ready to go. I'm going to take the 60-degree cone center out. I still want to keep pressure on the end of that blank, so I'm going to use my one-way live center. I'm going to take the point out, and I'm going to put a different point in, one that's dead flat. This will apply pressure to the end of the blank, but not damage it or mar it. So I'm keeping pressure between the end of that and the bushings. And while I add my finish. At this point I'm using a little bit of carnauba wax, which I rub on, and then with a paper towel just burnish it in. It needs a little bit of heat so it'll flow, but on the oily exotic it's difficult to put too many different kinds of finishes on. It just won't stick. So now I do the same thing on that end. And we have the blank finished. There's that extra brass tube that I needed to support the nib end. So now it's simply a matter of taking the assembly that was pre-assembled, pressing it into place, and we have a pen. It's okay. It's kind of okay. Not to my liking. I'm going to go back to the lathe again. So I've remounted it, and I think I'm going to cut a series of marks down the length of the pen just to give it a little bit of character. So I'm using a D-Way 1/8 inch beading tool to create a series of marks. The left wing of the tool rides in the former groove. The right wing of the tool is actually cutting the next groove. I have to be cautious that only the right wing is cutting and the left wing does not add extraneous marks. Now, by using a beading tool like this, I can get my spacing between the various lines pretty daggone even. Couple more, and we'll have it. Now we've got some nice marks, and they're well spaced, but they're not as clean as I'd like them to be. So I want to burnish the bottom of these, and I'm going to take a burning wire, one of my smaller burning wires, and I'm going to go in each and every one of these marks, not to burn it, but simply to round out the bottom. It's sort of like sanding. Just go down the length, couple 3 seconds. I don't want to raise the temperature and burn it. I just simply want to make them look nicer. Now that will still tend to raise the grain at the surface a little bit. Yeah, it feels that way. So I'm going to have to polish that surface again. Use my 4-aught steel wool simply to burnish away any of those burrs that were raised. I'm going to finish it this time with a microcrystalline wax that I have acquired a few years ago. It's very similar to the Renaissance wax, or frequently used here. Provides a nice feel to the surface. It provides a surface that is not only nice to feel, but it also handles fingerprints and other debris. So rub that on and polish it back out. I enjoyed making this project so much that actually after I finished filming this, I went back to the lathe, took another piece of wood, a little fancier, and made another one just like that. You'll see it as soon as I can figure out how to assemble this. Yeah, green side up, right? There we go. So the pen is done, and that is the project. Well, I hope you enjoyed that one. We turned just another of the kits that have been modified from the standard 7mm kit components. Had we made this top a little bit longer, we could have made a long desk pen out of this. We had one concern, and that was to be sure that when we drilled the blank, that we didn't drill the hole too deep. It needs to be exactly the right length for 2 brass tubes, and just enough extra wood left over that we can close the top end. I did need to borrow 1 brass tube from another kit to help support that blank while we're doing the turning. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you try some pens and see what you can do and what modifications you can come up with. Thanks for watching. We appreciate your subscriptions. I appreciate your comments and questions. Thanks for being a viewer. Appreciate it.